AP founding documents. I'm going to hit record and not forget that step. Welcome, students. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about the AP founding documents. Now, what the AP is, it's called advanced placement. And these are tests that many students take in high school, and they take an entire course on AP government. And in that course, you're exposed to 9 founding documents. And we thought it would be awesome for all of our students to talk about these documents and look at why an organization like the College Board would pick these documents and what do they have to tell us about the story of America and how our country works. So I'm really excited that I'm not alone in this work today. I'm here with Tom Donnelly, one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center. Tom, how excited are you about these 9 documents?
Very, very, very excited, Kerry.
So let's get started. So we have 30 minutes. We can do this. Students ask lots of questions in that chat. But let's begin with an easy beginning for at least America, the Declaration of Independence. This is the first in our timeline of these 9 documents from the AP Gov class. And students, if you're taking the test this semester or end of the year in May, please let us know if you have any questions. We can help as much as we can. So Declaration of Independence, Tom, this is a big one, kind of makes sense. When we think about what the big idea is in this document, what should students hold on to say, how does it impact and affect our country? And then tell us a little the story of how it came to be.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, the way I think of it is it's America's statement of purpose. You know, it's the beginning of our project in many ways, and it unites 2 really big ideas, popular sovereignty and natural rights. And we see this in the opening passage that is so famous, we can all say it by heart, but this idea that we just as being human beings, we're created equal and we have certain rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all have those natural rights. Those are the foundation everywhere in the world, but they're certainly the foundation here in America. But we also learn from the document is that governments have a certain foundation and a certain purpose. So where does government's power come from? It comes from the consent of the governed. It says, we say yes. We say, yes, we need a government. What do we need a government for? Well, the Declaration tells you it's to protect our life, liberty, happiness, equal rights, all of these natural rights. The government's there to make sure that those are protected. And finally, the ultimate statement of popular sovereignty, the idea of rule by we, the people, is that if the government's not doing that, we have a right to change that government, to engage in a revolution, which we're doing in the Declaration. But the last thing, and this is important to the Declaration itself, is that once we're going to do that, we have a duty to tell the government and the world why we're doing it. And so the Declaration is both a statement of broad principles, but it's a very practical document explaining to the British Empire and to the rest of the world why it is we're declaring independence.
That is awesome, Tom. And I think it's such an important idea to think about. This encapsulates our principles as Americans. Now, when we think about the Declaration of Independence, and we so easily jump to the Constitution next, but that's not really what happened next. We did have an in-between document that was a governing document, and maybe it wasn't so great. So could you tell us a little bit about that document, the Articles of Confederation, and how was it laying out how we were working together as new states, and what made it so weak?
Sure. So with the Declaration, it's obviously July 4th, 1776. And here as we get to the Articles of Confederation, Congress approves them November 15th, 1777. And it'll ultimately be ratified March 1st, 1781. But the key point here is that, even projecting forward to the Constitutional Convention, when we're creating a new constitution in Philadelphia, we have a national government in place. It is written in these Articles of Confederation. And the number one thing to remember about the Articles of Confederation, created a weak national government. What they said is it's a league of friendship. And so the way I often think of this is that under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was a lot more like the United Nations in many ways. A lot of independent states, the states under the Articles of Confederation maintain almost all of the most important powers, and the national government is quite weak. And so what are some of the features of the Articles of Confederation? Well, the government's comprised of a single House of Congress. So it really, the entire government is the Congress. Unlike the Congress we have today, it's only a single house, it's not two houses. There's no separate executive branch, no separate judiciary. And then the national government itself has very few powers. It doesn't have many of the powers we would associate with a typical national government. It doesn't have the power to tax, to regulate commerce between the different states, even to raise an army. And then the last part, and this is so important, is to amend this charter, it required unanimity. Every state had to agree to any amendment to the Articles of Confederation. And as a result, we never were able to amend it. Even as we learned over time that it was an imperfect document, we could not amend it. And I guess the last feature of it too is that the structure of the government itself gave each state an equal vote. So every state gets an equal vote in Congress. So whether it's a large state like Virginia or a very, very small state, it each gets the same number of votes.
And that's so important because it also shows how many things we learned and kept as like, oh, this is a good idea, but then we add it to it. So I think the easiest one when we get to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 is that you can amend this new constitution that's proposed. It has Article 5. Now, Tom, when students are taking the AP government exam, they're looking at the Constitution and, you know, what does it say? How did it happen? But they're also looking at the structures. So as you dive into this, can you also kind of lay out what's the job of Article 1? Whose job is it? Article 2, Article 3, and the interplay. Because students, if you are taking the exam either now or in the future, some of us adults want to take it just to see how we would do, but you have to compare. Like that's the big thing about these exams, and especially the essay questions, is how do you compare different pieces and show similarities and tensions? So go for it, Tom. Lay it out for us.
Sure. So yeah, the connective tissue here is that because of the failures of the Articles of Confederation, many people, even people who end up opposing the Constitution itself, even some anti-federalists, reached the conclusion that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, that we needed to either change them or replace them altogether. And so Congress calls a convention in Philadelphia for the express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. But we have key figures like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, many people who become strong Federalists, strong supporters of the Constitution, thinking we need to do more. At this convention in Philadelphia, we need a new form of government altogether. And the big idea here, Kerry, is that, you know, we wanted to, the founding generation there in Philadelphia wanted to create a government that was stronger than the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers. So it's kind of striking that right balance between something stronger than a quite weak government, but something weaker than maybe a monarch. You know, we didn't cast off the British Empire to suddenly have another distant government abuse our rights. And so it's really trying to strike that balance that was so difficult in Philadelphia. And, you know, the practical thing here, that the convention itself lasts from May 14th, 1787 to September 17th, 1787. So I think we say it's like a little under 40 working days. They're doing quite a bit of work to set up this new government. And, you know, should we just sort of walk through the key parts so we can get a sense of what's in there?
Article 1, pretty much right after the preamble, the first paragraph. Think about it, students, when you're thinking about the structural constitution, remember they're articles, not amendments. That's what's in this core constitution. So the preamble, and maybe Tom even start us with the preamble. What does the preamble state? And then what is Article 1, 2, and 3? I think those 4 big areas would be great for the students.
You know, regardless, I was going to start with the preamble.
I know, so that's why I backed up and said, I'm going to let you start with the preamble.
But yeah, so the original Constitution, this one that was drafted in Philadelphia in 1787, it's a preamble and 7 articles. That's this, when we say the original Constitution, the structural Constitution, the unamended Constitution, that's what we mean. It starts with the preamble, and this is those inspiring words, we the people. And in many ways, it's expressing our deep commitment to popular sovereignty, which is just a fancy way of saying government by we the people, government by us, not by a monarch, not by the elite, not by the few, but by us, we the people. As Lincoln would say, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's what popular sovereignty means. And so it's right there in the original Constitution. And we saw already it was right there in the Declaration of Independence as well. It's a foundation for everything. So as we get into the Articles of the Constitution, Articles 1, 2, and 3 lay out the 3 branches of government. So Article 1 gives us Congress. Congress is tasked with making the laws. So they're passing laws, they're really defining policy for the nation. Now, one thing to note about Congress is it's by far the longest article in the Constitution. The thought was from the founding generation that Congress was going to be the most important and most powerful branch. And so what they had to do in setting up Congress was to set up the structure itself, but they also wanted to define both the powers and limits of Congress. So what are some of the big decisions they made? Well, one of the really big ones they learned from the Articles of Confederation, no, we don't want just a single Congress. We want two houses of Congress. If we're going to make the national government more powerful, if Congress is going to be the most powerful branch, we want to split that power between two houses. We call this bicameralism. And the US House and the Senate end up being structured differently. So the US House of Representatives, the most important thing to remember about it is that representation there is based on population. So if the larger the state, the more representatives it has in the House of Representatives. And so this is seen again as sort of being rooted more directly connected to the people, directly connected to this idea of popular sovereignty. The bigger the state, the more the people, the more the political power, the more the representatives. But the Senate preserves one key feature of the Articles of Confederation, which is that the Senate is based, its representation is based on the principle of equal representation. So each state, regardless of its size, regardless of its population, gets two senators. So if it's a big state like Virginia, a small state like Rhode Island, they all get two senators. And so this is our system of Congress, two houses, bicameralism, the House, the Senate. The other key thing that you see in Article 1 of the Constitution is it also is going to define the powers of Congress. So this is everything from some of those powers that the Articles of Confederation didn't have, like the power to tax and spend for the general welfare, the power to regulate interstate commerce. Congress has certain set, very, very important powers, but it's also clear from the Constitution that Congress's powers are limited and that the states are still going to preserve a lot of their power from prior to the Constitution. So that's Article 1. Article 2 gives us the presidency. And so the president is the executive branch, is headed by a single president. The executive branch is charged with enforcing the law. And so here, the founding generation, what they were looking to do was to create an office that was stronger than a lot of the weak governors they saw in their state constitutions and the state governments, but something weaker than a monarch. And so they come up with a single president. The president in Article 2, we have certain other things in there, define some of the key responsibilities of the president. For instance, being the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. But the most important thing to remember is it's a single president, and the executive branch itself is tasked with enforcing the laws. Finally, we have in Article 3, the judicial branch. So the judicial branch is headed by a Supreme Court, and the judicial branch is tasked with interpreting the Constitution. And the thing that you'll notice if you read the Constitution is that Article 3 it's a very short article. There's not a lot that's spelled out there. Actually, a lot of the details are left to Congress to fill in with later laws. But there are really two big things to remember about the federal judiciary. One is that Article 3 is meant to ensure a certain degree of judicial independence. Really, the most important part of that is providing for life tenure for federal judges. So this means that judges will serve for basically until they die or they resign, unless they're removed from office through the impeachment process, which virtually never happens. And so it's this important way of making sure that the judiciary is independent from politics and the other branches of government. The last thing is the federal judiciary is going to be responsible for carrying out judicial review, using the power of judicial review, which means that it's going to review the actions of government actors to say whether they're constitutional or unconstitutional. So that's it on the Constitution, Kerry.
Awesome. So Article 1, Congress, laws under their powers. Article 2, president, enforcing. Article 3, interpreting the laws and the judicial review. Awesome, lays out really nicely. And they have to all work together in certain ways and are pulled and pushed at each other in certain ways too. That's that separation of powers and the checks and balances. A couple questions that came in that I really adore. And so we're going to add them in. So Riley said, why did it take 4 years to ratify the Articles of Confederation after they approved it on November 5th, 1777? Nice observation that you saw that gap, Riley. Tom, why did it take 4 years?
I mean, just because it required everyone to agree. I mean, practically speaking, the thing to realize is that Congress functioned under the Articles of Confederation, even though they weren't formally ratified. So practically speaking, it wasn't that important. They weren't formally ratified, but it was a long process. We're also fighting the Revolutionary War. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I was going to say there was a lot. Next question from Riley was there a time the number of senators in the number of representatives in the House of Representatives went down? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So was there like the Great Migration or something like that, that per state did it drop in certain areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the one thing you even see with the census that just happened. So every time some states are going to go down, some are going to go up. And so, yeah, I mean, for instance, in the late 20th century, we saw, the Southwest and the Southeast receive, as people moved down there, receive more representation. So it alters over time, and we see shifting balances of power for sure.
And then I love this one that came in from Samantha that rolls us into the next part. So Samantha wants to know if anyone tried to sabotage the Constitutional Convention, either from inside or out. Pinckney comes to mind, but really what I was thinking at the end of the convention and the dissenters. And I wouldn't know if I would call it sabotage or standing up for what's right, but I really liked the way Samantha thought of that question. So was there any kind of direct sabotage, or what were the big speed bumps along the way that were put in by members?
Yeah, I don't think I would. That's a great question. I don't think I would frame it as sabotage, but it is important to realize there was a real fight over approval of the Constitution. Like, we think of it as, of course, there's going to be a new Constitution. Of course, it's going to be ratified. But what's so notable about the convention is the framers sat there, they wrote this document, they signed it, they approved it, but they said, it's not up to us whether or not we're going to adopt this government. It's up to you. And so they sent the document back to the American people state by state to say yes or no in conventions in each state. So at the convention itself, the Constitutional Convention, at the end, we have these three figures who say, no, we're not going to sign the new Constitution. It's Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason. And so, these aren't just a bunch of they're not just like grumpy people who are trying to sabotage the convention. Many of them were highly involved in so many of the debates and compromises that happened during the course of the convention. They just thought there were two big things the convention got wrong. One, there was no Bill of Rights. And two, related to that, too much government was taken away from the states and given to the national government. And we would then see these debates carried out state by state in the ratification process. So, what does it take to ratify the Constitution? It's in Article 7 of the Constitution. It's going to take 9 states saying yes. So we've gotten rid of unanimity. We're no longer in the Articles of Confederation land. But we're saying if 9 states say yes, that's enough to start this new government. And so state by state, we have elections, we form constitutional conventions, we have debates in those conventions. And over time, what we see is two sides develop, what we call today the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists in support of the new Constitution, the Anti-Federalists against it. And we see powerful arguments, both practical and in really political theory, high political theory throughout these debates. Should we start with the Anti-Federalist voice on our list here, Kerry, to give a sense?
Yes, and we hear so much about the Federalist Papers, but we never talk about the Anti-Federalist writings. So I thought we'd start with Brutus today, which in the timeline, it's the first that begins this in the newspapers, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so tell us, what is Brutus? What was the point of Brutus? And was the person writing Brutus a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist? And why were they worried about the Constitution or not the Constitution?
Sure. So Brutus is one of the leading Anti-Federalist voices in the newspapers. So it's thought there's still some debate as to who the author is. It's a voice in New York, an Anti-Federalist in New York. New York had strong, even though Alexander Hamilton was from there, had strong Anti-Federalist support. Thought as Brutus might be Robert Yates, who was originally at the Constitutional Convention and left it because he thought that the convention was going beyond its powers in creating this new government. And so with Brutus, we see really some great examples of the types of arguments you see in the Anti-Federalist writings. So one is, Brutus is quite upfront. He's saying the articles aren't great. I don't love the Articles of Confederation. There are problems in America, and we need to figure out how to get our national government in order. But don't listen to the Federalists. The Federalists are saying it's a crisis and demands action at this moment, and you have to say yes to this new Constitution. Don't worry, we can figure out changes we need to make down the road. It's not a perfect document, but you should ratify it. Brutus is saying, no. What does history teach us? It teaches us once you give power to a certain set of people, they're going to keep taking power. So we have to be careful when we're looking at this new document. And there are reasons to be concerned in Brutus's mind. One of them is, if you look at the document itself, it seems to give a lot of power to the national government, takes a lot of power away from the states. There's a lot of language in the Constitution that's really broad and can be interpreted in ways for the national government to take more and more power over time. His concern is that we're going to have a government, the technical word he says is it's going to be consolidation. But all that really means is that national government's going to get all power and the states are going to be left with none. Why is that a problem? Well, it's not going to be all that different from when we had the British Empire across the Atlantic. We don't have a lot of travel in the United States at the founding. Who cares if it's in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, or London? If you're in a lot of the United States, that's really far away. It's going to be distant elites dictating policy for us rather than people close to us in the states. And this is connected to the other key criticism, and that's that, it was within political theory, the thought was a republic. So a representative government with elections and representatives is not going to work in a big country. It's only going to work in a small area with people who know one another, people who are very similar, where they can actually unify around a vision of the common good and carry it out. So once you get a really, really large republic like the United States, what history teaches us is that republic is going to fail. And Brutus was concerned about that.
And I love this because this fits so much nicer with Federalist 10. Because Federalist 10 is Madison saying, no, you're wrong. This is actually why it'll work better. So students, when you read these, again, you're reading them as how they're talking to each other in the newspapers, and they're trying to be persuasive of all the people in the newspapers. But Tom, before we jump there, Morgan wanted to know, how do you think the Anti-Federalists would feel about the government's handling of COVID-19? So just making the Anti-Federalists a little modern, what do you think? They think they'd be for it or against it?
Really tough question, because there's a degree to which, if for them, so much of the debate was over federalism. And so they would be very concerned if the national government's taking on a lot of responsibility. But you can imagine a division of opinion within the Anti-Federalists about how much power the states would have. And so how they would balance state power against rights protections. And I think it's an open question. I mean, there's always an open question when you try to time travel across history, but it's a great question. But the thing to understand about the Anti-Federalists is they have a certain faith that small communities can come together and come to solutions they can all agree to. And so they would have a certain faith, perhaps, that state governments or even local governments would be able to do that.
Got it. Cool. Okay, so now jumping to Federalist 10, real quickly before we jump there, could you tell us just a little bit about the Federalists, who they were, and then we'll jump to Federalist 10.
Yeah, so the Federalist Papers are in many ways the best organized, most coherent defense of the Constitution during the ratification debates. They're practical documents. They're in newspapers. They're in response to strong anti-federal support, especially in New York. I mean, why does Alexander Hamilton think that he has to write? Part of it's because Brutus is writing, and Hamilton's from New York, and he needs to battle back against the Anti-Federalists. And so the Federalist Papers are this series of writings under the name Publius that are written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. Most of them are written by Hamilton and Madison, but in support of the Constitution. And so it's both high theory and very practical nuts and bolts as to how the government's going to work.
So when we think about Federalist 10, we think about Madison trying to explain why this type of government structure will work as we see our country grow and expand. And so they have that mindset that it isn't going to stay just like this, that there is going to be growth, and that this is a flexible and growing system. At least that's what Madison tries to get across. What are the big ideas in Federalist 10?
So Federalist 10 is about faction. It's all about faction. It's all about responding to those arguments we just heard from Brutus.
And Madison, I'm sure our students know what faction means.
I'm gonna say exactly how Madison, yes. And so this is a response to Brutus. It's a response to what everyone is arguing or has argued in political theory, which is that large republics like America can't work. A national government that unifies all of the states and has a lot of power, or at least more power than the Articles of Confederation, can't work. And what Madison says is, no, you're wrong. I've thought about this. Actually, large republics are better. Large republics can solve some of the problems that we know will exist in any government. And so what does Madison mean by faction? So faction here means a group of people that are driven by passion or self-interest rather than reason and the public good. And so what Madison says is, if you're concerned about faction is that a minority faction, so a faction that can't get majority support is going to make bad policy, a republic itself can solve that. A majority can outvote the minority and the minority will not repress us. But what we have to be concerned about, and what we've learned from our own state governments, which are quite democratic, and we've seen some bad policy come out of them, but also from history itself, is that minority faction isn't the only problem. We know that people are going to continue to divide over issues. We know that people are going to be self-interested. We know they're going to be passionate, but we also know that we want government based on reason and the public good. And so what we have to be able to do is to control not just minority faction, but the danger of majority faction, the danger that there may be a majority in the community that can come together, shape policy, and then harm the minority. And so how do we do that? How do we both make sure that we can put good representatives in office, but also guard against the dangers of abuses by an elected majority? And his answer is, it's a larger republic, and it solves the problem in two ways. One is that, just as a practical matter, you make the republic bigger, you then have more and more groups pushing for more and more different things, and it's hard for any particular group to get a majority and to dictate policy, and because of that, to harm everyone else. So by what he says, expanding the sphere, but really making the actual government and the nation bigger, it takes away some of those dangers of faction by dividing factions. The other, though, is when you enlarge the republic, when you make it bigger, when you have a government representing more and more people, it's actually going to improve the people that you elect as representatives. His vision was that then only people really, what he would say, continental character, people with really good reputations, people who are more likely to be public-minded, are going to be elected to office. And so we'll never have officials that are truly virtuous in every perfect way. Madison was much more a cynic than he was an idealist, but he did believe that the structure of government, and by having a large republic, could improve the sorts of people we have in elected office, and that they can then be the ones to work together to shape public dialogue and to create good policy that promotes the common good.
Awesome. We were just joking that, but Madison didn't know about social media, but that's for a different class. And so let's keep going, because we have I think four more founding documents to go through. So Federalist 51, and then Federalist 70 and 78 are the Federalist Papers, the next three that we're going through.
Okay, it shouldn't be that hard to tick through them. So Federalist 51, all about separation of powers and checks and balances. So here, Madison's big concern is, we're creating a government with more power. The anti-federalists are right to be concerned. We are always concerned that government's going to abuse powers, that the people in office are going to be ambitious, that they're going to push against their limits. And so what's my solution? What's the Federalist solution? What's the Constitution solution? It's to divide power between the three branches of government. So you'll have different responsibilities for the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. We saw that with Articles 1, 2, and 3. But the other is that we're going to give each of those branches a way to defend against the other branches. So Congress can pass laws. Well, the president can veto those laws. And if the president vetoes that law, if it cancels that law, Congress can come back in and override the veto. And furthermore, we then have a judicial branch that's there to hear challenges. When people say, no, what the government did is unconstitutional, we have a judicial branch to then hear those cases, hear those controversies, and decide yes or no using judicial review. But the big idea here is that we're going to give powers to each of these branches of government. Ambition is going to be made to counteract ambition, is the famous line, but that each branch is going to have an interest in defending themselves, and the framers gave them the power to do that. And through that, we can limit government abuse and preserve our liberties.
Awesome. And next is Federalist 70. Oh,
Federalist 70.
I'm sorry, wait, did I skip? No, Federalist 70, I'm right.
Yeah, Federalist 70 is next. And so this is Alexander Hamilton. It's about the presidency. And the two words to remember from Federalist 70 are energy and accountability. Those are the two big things that Hamilton has to say about the presidency. What Hamilton's doing is he's pushing against this criticism of the Constitution that the executive branch is going to be too powerful. The American people, of course, are skeptical of executives having too much power. That's why they cast off the king. You know, they don't want just a single person to have too much power in government. That could lead to despotism. It could lead to the abuse of our rights. But what Hamilton says is that, you know, one, we have to be concerned, especially about the powers of Congress. Congress, we need people that can check Congress within the government. And with the presidency, our solution is make it a single person. The reason you have a single president is one, energy. So what Hamilton meant by that is that with a single person, they can act speedily, they can carry out the law speedily, they can enforce the law speedily. They can also easily interact with the nations of the world. So you have a single head of state that's able to shape foreign policy and relations with other governments in important ways. But finally, because it's a single person, there's nowhere to hide. You are accountable. You are a very visible figure in the government. And if you act poorly, you will be checked and thrown out of office. It's that simple.
Awesome. Next, and this is our last of the Federalist Papers, is Federalist 78.
So Federalist 78 is all about Article 3, the judicial branch. And we've already talked a bit about that when we talked about Article 3, but Hamilton is reinforcing some of those things we said earlier, which is, he calls the judicial branch, it's going to be the weakest branch, it's going to be the least dangerous branch, doesn't have an army, doesn't have a ton of money. All it really has is its reputation and its judgment. But it serves an important function in our system. And what does the Constitution do? Well, it ensures judicial independence. And so this is the idea that judges are going to serve for life. They're going to be able to serve for a long period of time, and they're going to be independent of the other branches of government. And that allows them to be an important check within the system to make sure that people are staying, to one, interpret the laws, but two, to make sure that people are staying in bounds as to the Constitution. And then this comes to the federal judiciary's big power of judicial review, that they will be independent of the other branches of government such that they can then determine whether the actions of government are constitutional or unconstitutional.
Our final document is absolutely, I think, a perfect one to end with because it brings us all the way back to the beginning again in the Declaration of Independence. So what we're looking, oh no, I'm sorry, we forgot, that's what I was forgetting. We skipped the Bill of Rights because the Bill of Rights comes in at the end of the Federalist Papers. So they're debating in the newspapers and they're trying to ratify this Constitution. But how does the Bill of Rights play into calming the debate and ensuring that the Constitution is ratified? I knew I was forgetting something.
So the Bill of Rights come out of the ratification debates. It's a reminder of the value of dissenting voices in the American constitutional tradition. It's the dissenters from the convention. It's the anti-federalists saying, no. What we need is a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Use that amendment process you put in the Constitution in Article 5 to put a Bill of Rights into the Constitution. And James Madison ends up being the primary author of the Bill of Rights, but he was skeptical. He didn't really necessarily think a Bill of Rights was necessary, but he heard the arguments during the ratification debates, but he also came to the conclusion that, we may not absolutely be required to put this Bill of Rights in there, but you know what? There are enough Americans of goodwill who care about this country, who are concerned about this Constitution, who would be reassured if we put a Bill of Rights in there. And he understood that for the American project to work, what had to happen was that people who disagreed with the Constitution need to come into the fold and make their disagreements part within the system rather than outside of it. And ultimately, the Bill of Rights, as we know, it's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It enshrines many of our most important freedoms in there, like free speech, religious liberty, a right to a jury trial. The original Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. But with the 14th Amendment and later Supreme Court decisions, we then expand the protections of many of the Bill of Rights protections to the states, making it truly a national charter of freedom for America.
And this is also a good segue into the final document, because I think so much of these individual rights that are spelled out in the Bill of Rights that are connected to the Declaration of Independence, you see them lived, embodied, and spoken to all Americans through Martin Luther King and one of his unbelievable pieces of writing, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. So can you give us the context of when this was written, why he wrote it, and who he wrote it to? Because I think that's so powerful and what a huge game changer it was in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so it's 1863. This is coming out of the civil rights activism, the direct action that was done in Birmingham, which led to backlash by the police force there. And Dr. King and the civil rights protesters were there was a judge's order in place saying, no more activities. They defied that order, and Dr. King ends up in jail. And while he's there, he writes this letter. And it's an unbelievably powerful document. It's directed actually to white moderates, fellow clergy people. And it really expresses some of his disappointment with them. But in many ways, it's also a statement. It's maybe the clearest statement of the general philosophy that's guiding Dr. King's approach to the civil rights movement as a whole. And it has a few notable features. One, and it's connected to everything we've talked about today, but Dr. King is very much in the tradition of American reformers that root pushes for reform in our foundational documents and values. Reminds me a lot of Frederick Douglass in the 19th century. It's a similar sort of thing where the argument that's being made here in Letter from a Birmingham Jail is America has great principles. Read the Declaration, read the Constitution. But we are not remaining true to those principles. And I'm here, my friends are here, we're all here to call on you to do it and to do it now. Because part of what Dr. King's pushing back against is there are white moderates in America at the time that are sympathetic to the goals of the civil rights movement, would say, you know what, we don't like these protests. We don't like these sit-ins. We don't like these marches. Just work within the process, work within the chambers of legislature and the courts. Enough of this direct action. Just wait, things are getting better. To which Dr. King says back, no. It's easy for you to say when you are not the subject of abuse, when you're not the subject of segregation, when you're not the subject of discrimination. And what we learn from history is that whenever the strategy is to wait, you're going to just end up keeping waiting because the people who are in power are not going to willfully give up power. Actually reminds me of what Brutus said during the anti-federalist debates that we talked about. But what King is saying that no, what we need to force action. The way to do that is through direct nonviolent action, the sit-ins, the protests, the marches. Because in the end, what we want to be able to do is we know that we tried to negotiate with a lot of the different governments. They don't want to act. And so what we need to do is we need to take action to create what he called constructive tension, to force people to take attention, to listen to what we're saying, and then through that, maybe force them back to the negotiating table. And at the absolute root of that is this idea of civil disobedience. And this idea that sometimes there's going to be unjust laws, things like segregation, things like, police actions against civil rights protesters, things like that. And what your duty is in the face of an unjust law, to say no to that law, don't listen to it, but do it openly, with love, and accept the punishment. And that is the greatest and truest way to honor the rule of law. And that's also the truest way for us to actually make the nation better, to spread the gospel of freedom and to get America to live up to its promise in the Declaration and the Constitution.
Oh, great ending. Gospel of freedom, people powered. I love it, Tom. Thank you so much for walking us through all these awesome documents. We're a little bit over, sorry everybody, but it was totally worth it to wrap it up with that empowering and thoughtful piece. That was great. I'm going to stop share, but Tom, don't go anywhere because the students do have a modern question for you on some court cases coming down. So everybody, if you have to jump, it's okay. You can jump. Class is ended. But if you want to say about one of the questions from our class,